we live in a time where information is abundant. Information is absolutely everywhere. Every so often, a piece of technology comes along, which means that the information suddenly becomes abundant. So we had, going way back to the printing press, when books became available, suddenly for the first time, people could read the words that had been written down, and they became available. And the Bible was obviously part of that. The Bible became available to people in the language that they know. And then, of course, the internet is probably the next big leap in terms of information and enabling people to share information. So suddenly, every piece of information ever could be digitized and put onto the internet in such a way that people could access it for very little cost. It's estimated that there's now over 250,000 new websites every day. So for someone who makes websites, that keeps me in a job. So 250,000 new websites every day added to the internet. There's around 67 million Instagram posts every day, and 682 million tweets estimated added to the information on the internet. There's also 4 million hours of videos uploaded to YouTube every day. So there's a lot of information. And with AI technology, they estimate that something like 50% of all internet articles are AI generated at the moment. So we live in a very information-rich age. My point is there's information everywhere. Most of the things you could ever want to know are probably on the internet and probably for free. If someone asks you a question you don't know the answer to, it used to be in the old days we just go, I don't know, I guess we'll never know. Now we reach for the device in our pocket and go, let me just check what the answer is to that piece of information. And so my question really is, are we any smarter for all this information at our fingertips? I think it's debatable, if we're honest. You can have all the information and content in the world and still make wrong decisions in your life. And what we actually need the most in our age is wisdom. Wisdom is very different to information. According to the dictionary, wisdom is the ability to use knowledge, experience, understanding, and insight to make sound judgments, good decisions, and act with discernment. But in a Christian sense, the word wisdom just means how to live well. How to live well. And I think there's a great desire in our culture and in our time to live well. And so that's what we're going to find in this book that we're studying. We're studying the book of James at the moment. As Joe mentioned, his Hebrew name is actually Jacob. James is like the English translation that we use. But we're studying this book, and it was written by Jesus' half-brother, James. And one of the interesting things that I hadn't quite realized until I studied it this week was that James is actually the earliest book in the New Testament. It's the first book we have recorded in the timeline. So this is written like before Paul's writing all his letters to all the churches. This is written very early in the church. And James was obviously a leader in the early church. And so this is one of the earliest books we have in the New Testament. And if I was to summarize the book, I would say it's a mashup between the Proverbs and the Sermon on the Mount. If you took the Sermon on the Mount and Proverbs and you kind of collided the two together, you get the book of James. And that's kind of the influences that are at work. Jenny mentioned Proverbs, obviously, to us. And so James was a man known for his wisdom. He was known in the time for being a man of wisdom. And so that's what this book is dripping with. It's dripping with kind of common sense wisdom. And you'll see quite a lot of parallels with Proverbs if you read through Proverbs in the way that he delivers things. And so Joe began the series for us last week, and then this week we're still looking at that first chapter, and it's kind of still the introduction. It's where he's kind of outlining some of the key themes that he's going to be looking at. And so last week he talked about a lot of different things, but he talked about this idea of pressures and trials and temptations and how we all face them and how we go through trials and difficulties is really important. He then finished last week with this idea of the word of truth. So we're going to begin by reading verse 18, which was in Joe's passage from last week, but it really unlocks the passage for today. So we're in verse 18, we'll put it on the screen. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. Verse 22, do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in the mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom, notice the freedom theme again, and continues in it, not forgetting that they have what they have heard, but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. Verse 26, those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Now, as we're going to say every single week in this series on James, there's a lot in there. Because he just densely packs stuff. And at first glance, it looks like he's a bit all over the place. It looks like he's talking about this and he's talking about that. But verse 18 gives us the key to what he's doing. He does have a thread to his thinking here. And verse 18 says, he chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. So James is kind of reminding the listeners that they've been reborn. That when we accept Jesus, we step into a new kind of life. And that new life came to us through this, what he says is the word of truth, which in simple terms just means the gospel. When he talks about the word of truth, he's talking about the message of Jesus and the way that he brought new life to us. He now says, we're the first fruits, or in other words, we're now a new creation people living in an old creation world. He then goes on to then explain and spell out what should it look like to be a new creation person living in an old creation world. And in other words, what does it look like to receive the word of truth? And then that's what the rest of our passage today is all about, is how do you receive and live differently because you've received the gospel? So we'll now look at verse 19. We'll put it on the screen. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. So he says here, he's got this phrase here, take note of this. And this is actually very similar to when Jesus would say, truly I tell you. Or he was in some older versions, truly, truly. And so it's like a pay attention. This is important. Listen to what I'm saying. And he has three things for them. Be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Now, I could spend the rest of the day just on those three things because there's a simplicity to what he says. But the challenge often with the Bible is not the bits we don't understand, it's the bits we do understand. That's the hard thing about James, is he just spells it out and says, this is how you should live. So just briefly looking at each of these, Christians should be quick to listen. That means that we need to come to people eager to hear what they have to say. That we should approach relationships in such a way that we come to people and say, I want to hear what's on your heart today. Listening is particularly hard in the world in which we live. We're like super distracted, left, right, and center all the time. Listening is really, really hard. You're probably thinking, yes, it is. I'm trying to listen right now. Listening requires concentration and focus and constantly redirecting yourself back to the thing that you're trying to focus on. And I can be just as guilty as anyone else here of like, when you're in a conversation with someone, you've also got your phone and you're kind of half listening and you're half doing something over here because you think you're being super productive because you're doing two things at once. But you're not really listening. You're getting enough of the words that you could probably piece it back together when the person says, are you listening? And you go, what were the words? I heard some words there. And then you try and piece it back together. Anyone else do that? Just me? You're like, yes, I was definitely listening. Listening is really hard. But this is the challenge that James gives us. He says, be focused on the person in front of you. Listen to them. Rather than worrying about what you've got to say, come to relationships in such a way that you're like, I want to hear and really hear what's going on for you. And it is challenging because listening means going slower. It means not interrupting other people. It means not zoning out when the other person's still talking. I would never do that. Where you're like, your brain goes off and, oh, that reminds me about something I need to do later. And the person's still talking and you come back and you're like, now what did they say? They said something. I'm sure it was important. And you bring yourselves back into it. You're all nodding, so I think you can probably agree. It's not just me. But it means like slowing yourself down and learning to be present in the moment, pushing other distractions aside. And I think it's like one of those really hard skills in our culture is the ability to listen. But I also believe it's something you can grow in. It's not just something you're either good at or you're bad at. I think if you intention yourself to grow in listening, you can become better at it. And I'm by no means an expert in this at all, but I've learned some things over the time. There are skills you can learn in listening to keep yourself focused. And like some of the listening skills are really important, particularly in conflict moments. Because if you fail to listen in a conflict situation, you will guarantee to make it much worse. And one of the tools they give you in listening is active listening. I don't know if you've heard this phrase. Active listening is where you say to the person, before you give back your piece, you say, what I heard you saying was, and you repeat back to them, this is what I heard you saying. And then the person might go, no, that's not quite what I'm saying. And then they come back to you again, and then you go, so what I'm hearing you saying, and you repeat it back to them. And it sounds kind of false, like to do that in a relationship. But trust me, see if you do that, people will feel really heard. Because you stop and you actually ask them, what did you mean? Because words are imprecise, and we don't always get across what we're trying to say. So active listening is one of those tools that you can use. You'll all be at coffee, you'll be like, so I heard what you said was... It can be false if you force it, but I think particularly in heated moments, if you're having a difficult conversation at work or in family, just to say, before I give you what I think, what I heard you saying can be a really important skill. And I think listening is important because listening is loving. Have you ever had a conversation with someone who just listened to you? And you just ranted and you got all the things on your heart off and you just said, this is what I'm feeling. This is all the difficult stuff that I'm going through. You leave those moments feeling more loved. You feel like you connected with someone else because I think listening is loving. I'm not very good at buying presents. Joe can attest to this. But for people who are good at buying presents, do you know what I've noticed they do? Is they listen. And they pick up on the little things that people say, and then they go, oh, that's a good idea. I could get them that as a present. If you're a good present buyer in the room, you're nodding like, yeah, that's what I do. I listen for when someone says something, and you go, yes, I could get them that. Listening is loving. So that's our first one. Christians should also be slow to speak. This is like the other side of this, is as well as being kind of coming in with that heart to listen, we're also supposed to be slow to speak, which means we don't feel we have to ram our opinions down other people's throats. That we're secure enough that we don't have to tell everyone what we think about everything. It means letting other people go first in a conversation. We sometimes think, I need to get my words in first, because if I don't get my words in first, I'm going to get trampled on. But the call of the gospel is we actually are prepared to go last, and we listen to someone before we share our piece. And that means I think sometimes the slow to speak thing is also not falling into that trap of feeling like we have to react to everything. We live in a culture which is very reactive. Like whatever happens, like they want to know, what's your reaction immediately? The news comes and they speak to someone, they say, this has just happened, what's your reaction? And most people's reactions are not where they finally land. Like people have an immediate reaction to something and then ask them a while later, they have a different response. And the call of being slow to speak is sometimes is reflecting before you speak. is thinking about what you actually want to say. Because as James will say again and again, our words matter. And once they're out there, they're quite hard to they're quite hard to pull back. So we're to be slow to speak. And I think this is connected to this idea of wisdom. I love Proverbs as well. And I love this proverb, 17:28. Even fools are thought wise if they keep silent, and discerning if they hold their tongues. It's like Ronan Keating said, you say it best when you say nothing at all. Or my translation was, you look wiser when you shut up. So by saying less and being slow to speak, you actually become wiser. Isn't that an interesting thing? And then finally, Christians should be slow to anger. And again, the anger themes come up in recent weeks. We've talked about this idea of anger. And again, it's not that he's directly saying all anger is bad. He's saying that anger has a dangerous side to it. If we are quick to anger, then we're letting our reactions run the course. We're letting our emotions, our initial response to things, drive our behavior. So in a world that's full of anger and frustration, just read the news, you'll see it everywhere. Anger and frustration and political turmoil and all of that, we're to be slow to become angry. Jesus didn't walk around offended and angry at everyone. He was full of joy and gentleness and peace. He didn't walk around angsty and on edge. Slow to anger. Anger can lead us away from God in our behavior if we're not careful. It can grow things in our hearts. Reading on in verse 21. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. He's coming back to this idea of the word. And so he's saying it's not just about the things we say and the listening and the way we approach conversations. There's actually a lot of, he's quite strong here, moral filth that we need to get out of our lives. And he returns to this idea a few times in the letter, that this idea that evil is actually everywhere. And the NIV is quite kind of plain here. It says, evil that is so prevalent. But it's more like, this super abundant evil that's bursting out all over the place. And James has this idea, this worldview that he's living through, that actually we need to be aware that the world is not neutral. That actually there is evil. There are things looking to corrupt you, and this idea of moral filth is quite a strong language. And it's connected to the idea in Ephesians that we looked at just a few weeks ago, where he gives that picture of like, take off clothes. He says, take off your old clothes and put on new clothes. And it's the same idea. It's like the dirt and the contamination comes on us. And he's writing to the tribes of Israel that are scattered across the land. And so these are people who are living in little Jewish cultures that are surrounded by a different culture. And he's saying to them, you're almost like aliens and strangers in the land. Be careful because there's evil all around you. People worshiping other gods. And he's making that parallel for us today as well, that we also live as strangers and aliens in the world as Christians, that we're surrounded by a world that is not for us, that our culture is not neutral. And then he comes back to the idea of a seed. He says, like, this word of truth was planted in us as a seed which can save you. It's an interesting word picture. We all, when we come to Jesus, get a seed planted within us. And that planted seed needs protecting and growing and nurturing. And he doesn't say here it's a guarantee of future salvation. He says, when the seed grows up, it will bring you salvation. And he's not talking about salvation when the terms we often talk about it. We talk about salvation as like the moment of salvation where we maybe pray a prayer and come to Jesus. He's talking about the salvation that comes at the end of the ages, when we're given our resurrection bodies, when Christ returns and the world is made new. He's saying that the seed of the gospel will grow and flourish within you, and eventually you will be fully saved and fully living as a new creation in this new world. So when he talks about salvation, he's talking about that future salvation. And that seed, he kind of uses this seed metaphor as like, we need to protect the seed that's within us. Reading on to verse 22. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourself. Do what it says. Now, verse 22 is probably the most famous verse in James. It's probably the one that if you knew a verse from James, this is the verse that you probably knew. And probably for good reason, because it probably summarizes the whole letter in some ways. It's like, don't just listen, you've got to actually behave in a different way because of what you believe. Don't just listen to the word, do it. And I love James's bluntness. For some people, the bluntness of James is too strong. But he's actually just real and truthful and in your face. And he says, don't just listen. But he goes further than just saying, don't just listen. He says that if you only listen to the word, you're deceived. Okay, wow, thanks, James. Like, he's quite strong here. He's saying, if you only listen to the word and don't do what it says, you're actually in deception. Information without action is deception. If you're just learning information about the word of truth and not changing your life, you're deceiving yourself. It's quite a kind of harsh rebuke for us, isn't it? And yeah, I can identify with it in so many areas of my life. One of the things I've been trying to teach myself over the last few years is music production. The ability of how to produce songs and how to mix them and all the technicalities involved in all of that. And one of the joys of the internet age that we live in is that there are thousands of hours of YouTube videos on the topic. So I can learn from some of the best people around the world at my fingertips. But the temptation is always just to watch another video rather than go and do something with the stuff I already know. And if you find anyone who is a skilled person in any craft, they aren't skilled and wise and excellent at what they do because they've watched lots of videos. It's because they've actually done the stuff. They've put into practice the stuff they've learned. They've got time in the game. They've worked out how to do it. And that's kind of what James is saying here. He's saying, don't just listen and take on information. Proactively make sure your life is being shaped and changed. Because reading information gives you a false sense of progress. You can feel like you're moving forward because you think you know something new. But as we all know, there's a difference between knowing in your head and really knowing through experience. And James is saying, lean into the experiential side of your faith. Don't just learn that God is love, experience God's love. Live differently because God loves you. Be more confident, be more gentle because God loves you. You know, I graduated from university in 2006, and in theory, I knew a lot. In practice, I knew nothing. And that's the kind of picture he's painting for us here, is you can be rich in knowing and listening to stuff, but will you change your life? You can attend church every week, and it can make you feel like you're growing. But growth comes from a changed life, not from just hearing more preaches. Knowing the Bible inside out, praying great prayers. All of that is good. But if your life is not changing, you're missing something. Jim says we're in deception. That's why we try to make our messages here at the church so practical. We try to tell you, here's something you could do this week. Because we're not trying to fill your heads with information. We're trying to lead our lives into transformation. We're going to read on now in verse 23. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in a mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forget what he looks like. But whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they have heard but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. There was lots of discussion in the commentaries around this whole kind of mirror image thing, but just for the sake of simplicity, he's basically saying that a mirror helps you see yourself better. You know, you catch yourself in the mirror and you can see, oh, my hair's a state, I need to do this. And who's ever had that moment where you realize that you've got food down your jumper and then you go out anyway, and then you're out and you go, oh, I'm still wearing that jumper with the food down the front. But a mirror gives you like a perspective on yourself. And it does that so that you can adjust. And he's saying that it's the same thing here. The word of truth gives you something that helps you reflect on your own life. And the goal is that you adjust, that you don't just go out with the messy jumper on still, that you actually realize and you make a change in your life. And he talks about this idea of the perfect law that gives freedom, which is a really interesting phrase. And of course, he has in mind here, because he's a Jew and this is writing to a Jewish audience, the Torah, the first 5 books, the law. But he's more specific than just the law as we might think about it. He's talking about the law as Jesus, his brother, understood it. So Jesus summarized the whole law and the prophets as saying, love God and love your neighbor. And so that's kind of what's in his mind here. And he's saying that if you love this kind of perfect law that brings freedom, you will be living out that loving God and loving others. And there's an interesting contradiction here between law and freedom. I don't know if you noticed that. Like, when we think about lots of laws, do we think about freedom? No. Often we would think lots of laws equals less freedom. And that's probably how most people outside the church think about religion. It's just a lot of laws, and those laws are going to come in and they're going to restrict my freedom. Why would I go to church? But there's a very different perspective here. And it all comes down to how you define freedom. So we live very much still in a world where freedom is seen, I can do whatever I want, and nobody can tell me what to do. It's the spirit of our age, isn't it? I can do what I like, and nobody can tell me that what I can do or not do. And the problem with that, it sounds amazing until you actually think it through, because every action that every person takes has consequences. Good consequences, bad consequences. So if you're exerting your freedom and doing whatever you want, the chances are that some of your actions are going to have and on other people. So this idea that freedom somehow makes the world a better place is an oversimplification. The idea that being completely free will somehow change your life is actually a mistake. Because some things, some freedoms actually lead to destruction. Some things that you think, I'm free to do whatever I want, actually lead you to a place of damage. And our world says, be free to accumulate as much wealth as you want. Be free to treat others any way you want. Be free to have sex with whoever you want to have sex with. Have the freedom to follow your dreams, whatever your dreams might be. Some of those paths are going to lead you into destruction, both of yourself and others. And Jesus offers a very different kind of freedom. He brings the kind of freedom that actually enables you to live out that perfect law, which is the culmination of what we're called to be as humans, to love God and love our neighbor. So God's law is designed in such a way that we can actually live those things out. That's the perfect law that brings freedom. It's the freedom to actually do what we were designed to do, which is to love God and love others. That's when we become most alive, we're most healthy as humans. The way I like to think about it is that the universe has a grain, like a piece of wood. The universe has a grain, and you either go with the grain or you go against the grain. And if you go against the grain, you get splinters. That's the way I think about it. That when we think about God's law, we're actually saying, he said, this is the grain of the universe. You can go the other way, but you're going to get hurt. And that's the picture we have here. And then we come to our final verses of this section. Verse 26, those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Now, you're all still with me, still practicing your active listening. There's also, this is a heavy message, I get it. It's James is not pulling any punches here. But he uses this word religion, and religion's a funny word because it's not used very much in the New Testament. For most of you, when you hear the word religion, you perhaps have a negative view of this idea of religion. James contrasts here the idea between good or pure religion and bad religion here. And he's saying, in other words, you can claim to have great religious experience, but if your words are loose and free and damaging, you're actually living in deception. He basically says the way you talk reveals what's going on the inside, which again is a very challenging thought from James. That your words are actually a picture of what's going on in your heart. That as much as you try and, like politicians, try to say the right words rather than the true words, people can tell. Your words reveal what's going on in the inside. He's saying that the fruit of true religion is your words get changed and shaped. Because your heart has been changed, your words change. Because Jesus has impacted your life, you speak differently and you behave differently. You should have control over your words. All your spiritual talk, all your prayers, all your religious activities are meaningless if you don't control the way you speak. You can pray more, attend more worship services, fast more, have more visions of heaven or whatever it might be, but if your chat is bad, it's worthless. It's got to shape the way we speak. And James, again, returns again. We'll come back to this theme of the mouth and how we use it. For him, it's one of those primary things. He later says, if you can control your tongue, you're perfect. So the words we have are important. And the big thing he's addressing here is a kind of sense of hypocrisy about doing good religious things, but not actually being changed and transformed from the inside. And maybe that's why we have a negative view of this word religion sometimes, is that hypocrisy of doing the right things, but not actually being a changed person. So he contrasts that kind of hypocrisy, just like Jesus does in his ministry, with this, what he calls pure or true religion. He says that if you've really been impacted by the gospel, it's going to lead you to certain activities. How do you treat the orphans and the widows? Now, in James's culture, it's important we understand why he singles out the widows and the orphans, because there was none of the support systems that we have in place today. So to be a widow was a really perilous thing, because in that day, women were heavily dependent on a man for income, for all sorts of autonomy reasons. They were not able to live as freely within their culture. So to be a widow in that culture was to lose all means of income, all means of status, to have, it wasn't like you could just go down and get a job. That's just not how it worked in their culture. So the widows and the orphans, there was no foster system, there was no protective services around it. To be an orphan and lose your parents, or to be a widow, was to basically be helpless in their culture, to have no support. And James's hard point for us here is if you've received God, if you live from the gospel, how you treat the most helpless people is one of the truest signs of how you're following the gospel. How do you treat the people in our culture who are the most downtrodden, with the least opportunities, the least help? How do you treat the least? How do you treat the people who can't offer you anything back because they've got nothing? How do you treat those who are helpless? Do you love and care for those who are lonely and abandoned? And because treating them well is a sign of what he calls pure or good religion. Do you move, and he talks about, do you go to them in their time of distress, which is almost like in their moment where they've just lost their husband, or in the moment where they become orphans? Do you rush towards the hurting, or is it too messy? That's the challenge here from James, is like, when people are hurting and desperate and lonely and having a crisis, do you run towards them, or do you run away? Do you lean in to the broken? Even though it's uncomfortable and it challenges you, that's the challenge James brings to us. Do you run away from grief and pain because it's too hard, or do you love your neighbor? And then he adds a final example of what it means to have true or pure religion. And he says to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Again, we've got this picture that James seems to have of a world that's polluted. Now, we obviously live in a culture where our world is fairly polluted. And the word pollution is taking on a whole new meaning for us when we talk about climate change and we talk about fossil fuels and pumping them into the atmosphere. James was writing way before all of that. And so we live in a world where we understand this idea that actually there are these invisible particles around in the atmosphere, and we can't see them, we can't touch them, but we know they're there. We know that, for example, living here in North Berwick, the air quality is better than living in Edinburgh, that actually there's pollution. And so he's painting this worldview that actually, again, the world is not neutral. That when you step out of your bubbles, you realize that actually the world is polluted. There are dangers and things that influence you in negative ways. And all of us are being shaped by our culture in ways that we probably don't even realize. And we've talked about some of the ways in which we might counteract that as people of faith. We talked about simple things like slowing down the pace of your life. In a world that's rushing around and forcing people to go faster, maybe God's calling us to go slower. Maybe it's the problem of isolation, that our culture is continually trying to isolate people and put them on their own. What if we break that down through bringing people into families? Maybe it's twisted ideas about what love is and what love isn't. Maybe it's this tribal thinking that's everywhere in our culture around politics and whatever the issue might be. These are all ways in which the world pollutes us, and unfortunately it pollutes the church too. And James's call to us is to live holy, set-apart lives in the midst of the world, but not polluted by it. And it's interesting when you take these two things that James has talked about, this idea of caring for the widows and the orphan, we would often call that social action, wouldn't we? Like social action, making a difference. And then this idea of not being polluted by the world, we might call this holiness. Pursuing God, being set apart for him and him only. And often churches, you'll find that lots of churches pick one or of these topics. You get churches that are really big on this idea of social action. We must make a difference with the poor in our communities. And then you often get churches that are like, actually, we want to really focus on holiness and discipleship and growing in who we are. But how often do you get churches where they bring both of these together? Social action and righteousness and holiness. That's what James calls us to do, to bring these two together. So let me wrap this up. Again, there's so much in James. And again, a lot of the ideas in this circle around this idea of the word of truth. You've received a seed of the gospel that planted it within you, and your job is to help it grow and flourish in your life. And to let the seed grow, it requires us to be open and humble. And he talks about humbly accept the seed that's been planted in you. So it requires an openness and a humility to let God work in our lives. It's almost like he's saying you have to live out these certain behaviors if you want to call yourself a Christian. And it's like Jesus came and he became, the Word became flesh. We know that from John 1. The Word became flesh. And what James is basically saying here is, once again, the Word must become flesh. That actually through us becoming the body of Christ, we embody and become the flesh. that the word of God, the gospel of Jesus, becomes lived out in a community. And he gives us these things to do. So I'll put this list up. And maybe there's one of these that speaks to you today, that because it's maybe too overwhelming to think about all of it. But is there one of these that speaks to you today that you feel the Lord might be just challenging you on? To be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger, to be in control of your words, to help the helpless, the poor, and staying unpolluted. Again, all these themes are going to come up in the letter again, so unfortunately you're going to hear some of this again. But these are the key messages that James is going to unpack and challenge us to live in. Every time we hear a new message of the word of the truth, every time we hear something from the Bible preached and taught, it's supposed to do something in our lives and change and shape the way we live. That we're supposed to have a bias towards action. That we should be asking ourselves, not do I know that, but do I live that? Because the danger is we know lots of things. The challenge is, how do we live lots of things? But it begins with the simple idea of just submitting ourselves to God's word. Because you will only be shaped and changed by the word if you actually submit yourself to it. You know, when I have a thought and God has a thought and they're not the same thought, only one of us is right. And that's the journey that we all go on, of realizing that we need to submit our lives again and again to the word. Most of us, like I said earlier, don't have a problem with, our biggest problem isn't the bits of the Bible we don't understand. It's the bits of the Bible we already understand. So it's a challenge for all of us just to submit ourselves again to the word and be known as people who do what it says, not just know what it says. Let me just pray for us. If the band want to come up and get ready as well. Jesus, we thank you for the words that you spoke to us through your brother James. And I know there's a lot of heaviness at some of the challenges in the word today. But I pray that there would just be no condemnation in this room. Where there's conviction, God, give us the humility to respond. But I just pray that there would be no condemnation from this word, but there would be an invitation to not live in deception, to not be polluted by the world, but to live as those called out from the world, to stand for you, to be righteous and holy, to be making a difference with the poor. And I thank you for the ways that we already do that as a church. I thank you for the way we can partner with Bethany to do the caravan. I thank you for the way that we can grow in holiness through our small groups and encouraging one another. I pray we'd be known as a church that goes both for making a difference with the poor and the lowly and the lonely, and also in pursuit of holiness. God, help that to be the story of this community. But Lord, help us to be doers of the word, not just hearers. Give us your strength by your Spirit to do that. Amen.